All right, man, peace. You know, brothers, I'm on record as stating that oftentimes many of the issues that the so-called black man has to deal with in this society are not even strictly based on racism per se, but racialism, which is a subconscious understanding that there are certain characteristics or attributes that you can assign to people based off of race or what have you. One of them we're seeing manifest itself in the NFL. And oftentimes not just incompetency, but also competency is attributed to certain people based off of how they look or who they're associated with, or sometimes even who they look like. Why do I say that? Because the Phoenix Cardinals, or the Arizona Cardinals, whatever they're called, recently hired a coach by the name of Kliff Kingsbury. And I'm not going to say that he got hired per se because he's a Caucasian, but I will say that there's no doubt in my mind that despite the fact that he's never been successful as a head coach, that he was hired because he's very reminiscent of Mr. Sean McVay. And he's shown that he has a great proficiency in being able to develop certain quarterbacks in the college system. And for the most part, many NFL teams today are playing a college style of offense, or at least some of them are. And many of the top coaches who have been in the NFL for a while are starting to amalgamate certain college football concepts with the NFL, like an Andy Reid per se. Now, Kliff Kingsbury was able to develop Pat Mahomes. He was able to develop Baker Mayfield. He was able to develop what's this kid named Johnny Manziel. So this may be part of the reason why he was hired as coach of the Arizona Cardinals, to see if they can bring forth or make fruitful the career of Mr. Josh Rosen, who had a terrible rookie campaign, despite talking a gang of shit before the draft, basically trying to shit on the rest of the draftees. So do I think that is strictly a quote-unquote racism issue why Kliff Kingsbury got hired? No, not necessarily. But there's no doubt that there are certain correlations made based on race and competency or proficiency. So, of course, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
All right. I want to get to this other hiring because it's very interesting. Obviously, there were more head coaching vacancies to fill, as 8 coaches were fired this year. In one of the spots at the Arizona job, the Cardinals hired Kliff Kingsbury, who knows a thing or two about quarterbacks. He was one, and he coached Patrick Mahomes and Baker Mayfield at Texas Tech. He'll replace Steve Wilks, who finished 3-13 during his one season in charge.
It's very interesting for me to see how easy it is oftentimes for black coaches to get fired after one season. Every once in a while they may get a second season, like the brother who was working over there with the Denver Broncos as the head coach. It's very obvious to me that John Elway wanted to fire him after 1 year, but he said, let me give him a second season so that I won't be accused of anything if I fire him after only 1 year.
Good hire, Stephen A?
No. I mean, and I'm not saying that. Listen, I understand.
Let me say this very quickly. I'm not going to call it a bad hire per se, but it's a hire that you're going to get only if you look like Kliff Kingsbury and if you have the history with certain college quarterbacks that he has. So various components come together to help him get a job like that. A so-called black coach with a history like he has is not going to get that job right away. He's going to have a head coaching job in college first, and also be a coordinator in the NFL, at least for a period of time before he's given the opportunity to be a head coach in the NFL.
I'm going to let Max get into what he feels. Here's what I'm feeling, because it really doesn't have that much to do with football. Okay, so, you know, we got players protesting national anthems and all of this other stuff. We got the whole Colin Kaepernick thing. But I'm looking at, look at the coaches that have been fired, and look at the coaches that's getting hired. Now, nobody's going to say anything about that, but I'm seeing cats get chances. You understand?
Well, Stephen A. Smith, I have news for you, because I've done videos about this in the past. You're not going to see any of these NFL woke meatheads protest so-called black men not getting opportunities as head coaches because they don't give a shit. Why don't they give a shit? Because most of them come from matriarchal households, and they're unaccustomed to having a so-called black man as their head anyway. So what difference does it make to them? They're more comfortable with a black woman or a white man as their head, as their guide, as their teacher, as their authority figure. They're not accustomed to having a so-called black man as their head. So they don't feel any real affinity towards having an older black man tell them what to do. So it does not even register to them when a black coach gets fired. They don't really give a shit. They're more interested in attention mongering and quote unquote social activism and quote unquote social justice than they are with the so-called black man being the head of the household. That's why that's the theme on my channel, because I understand what the real issues are, not what the gestures are about. The gestures are all tomfoolery and nonsense. But in order for most of these wokey woke NFL meatheads to want to protest about black coaches not getting opportunities, it actually has to register in their minds that they should want to have a black male figure as a leader, and they've never had that for their entire life. So why should they care to have that now? You understand? That's how the so-called black man, that's how he attacks issues on a lower level as opposed to a higher level. And when I say the so-called black man, I'm not talking about all brothers. I'm talking about the majority of the wokey wokes. Okay, but Stephen A. Smith brings up a valid point. But that really starts to poke and prod into a deeper issue. And Stephen A. Smith is part of the problem because he wants black athletes to be leaders when they're not. They're not capable of analyzing society on a deep level for the most part. So if you cannot analyze society on a deep level, how can you come up with the solutions for these problems?
Under certain conditions that I don't think African Americans would ever get the chance. So I'm going to leave it at that for this moment in time. But when he got this job, again, I'm just sitting there going like this. Okay, you worked with Manziel and you worked with Baker Mayfield and you worked with Patrick Mahomes, whatever. But when you were a head coach, what did you do? I'm going to leave it at that.
First of all, before I get into that, I want to pick that up right there because I brought this up yesterday.
Sure.
There may be a new kind of, call it soft racism or kind of invisible racial prism through which things are happening right now in the NFL.
No, not just the NFL. Overall society, Max Kellerman. Right now, racism is not overt. It's more subverted, but it's still there. It's how people understand things subconsciously, how they make correlations subconsciously. It's not about hanging signs outside of bathrooms or water fountains anymore and segregation, things of that nature. It's more what they attribute to how you look or how you're stereotyped, quote unquote. Overall, it's always going to take the so-called black man a far longer time to attain to a leadership position and to be quote unquote trusted because he's not allowed to develop as a leader in his own household. So how can he be associated with leadership in the real world? You understand? The so-called black man is not even leading his own household for the most part. So by the time he gets out to the real world, he has no experience with that. So now nobody quote unquote trusts him. And he does not even trust himself because he's been told his whole life that he should be trying to move towards unity with everybody, which always means that he's at the very, very bottom of the hierarchy. So the so-called black man has been trained to assume the position from his childhood. It's very difficult for him to overcome that programming when his mother and the school system, for the most part, have taught him that he's not really qualified to be a leader. The so-called liberal black woman will not tolerate you as being a leader over her. Okay, so once that's imbued in the male black boy, how is he going to overcome that when he becomes an adult?
Oh, I remember Bill Polian talking about the Rooney Rule on this show a couple years ago, talking about the issue is the pipeline.
Yeah.
You have people in the pipeline ready for those interviews.
Clearly,
well, the real issue is not just the pipeline, Max Kellerman. The real issue is that, and I've heard other so-called NFL experts touch on this before, most of these head coaching positions come from player positions that are associated with decision making on the football field, that being the quarterback, the center, the middle linebacker, the safety. They're normally the ones who place the other players on the field in the appropriate positions. So normally they're the ones who move over to become coaches. Oftentimes the backup quarterback becomes a coach because he's learning where everybody's supposed to be placed on the football field. And he's normally standing right next to the head coach and the offensive coordinator on the sideline with a clipboard in his hand. That's what Kliff Kingsbury was. He was a backup quarterback for the most part. So now that we're seeing so-called black men start to attain more of those positions as quarterback, we might see that down the line 10, 15 years from now, assuming that this society is still around 10 or 15 years from now, for him to get more opportunities as an offensive coordinator. Right now, one of the hottest names in the NFL is Eric Bieniemy, who's the offensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs. So we'll see if he's able to attain certain jobs that will come down that pipeline. And he's associated with somebody who's recognized as an offensive mastermind in Andy Reid. And he's the offensive coordinator for Pat Mahomes. So if that does not give him a certain amount of credibility, I don't know what does.
And once upon a time, the stereotype was that a black man couldn't be quarterback of an NFL team because they, lacked leadership qualities or cerebral capacity, whatever.
Right, but that's the same stereotype that goes on in corporate America. They don't want the black man to be a manager or a director or even a supervisor for the most part. Because they know who are the first people who are going to come against a black male supervisor or manager or director? Black women. They're going to be the first ones to come against a black man in leadership. No doubt about it. Of course, you're also going to have the other races who are going to come against them because, once again, the so-called black man is not associated with leadership. Okay? So that's the real issue. Once the so-called black man takes over his household, there's going to be a trickle-down effect. And brothers have to stop falling for this okie-doke, this paradigm of believing that it's okay for the so-called black woman to be the head. Because all you're doing is feeding fuel to the fire. You're feeding more wood into that fire to disenfranchise yourself. And it has a trickle-down effect overall all across the board.
Whatever it was, right? They would ask Warren Moon about that. And now maybe that's transferred or gone underground in a way, maybe in ways in which decision makers aren't even aware. But who are getting the jobs now? The offensive coordinators. The guys who understand the new, Big 12 NFL, right? Are there African-American candidates even in the pipeline who are offensive coordinators?
Yes, Eric Bieniemy.
And then in the position to get those jobs, if the answer is no, then now you're starting to get to the root of the problem.
Right.
I would say this about Kingsbury quickly.
And I remember Eric Bieniemy being a running back in Colorado back like 20 plus years ago. I remember him on that team. I believe he was on the team with Cordell Stewart. One of you brothers can correct me on that. For those of you who go back long enough, the quarterback Cordell Stewart / played with the Pittsburgh Steelers. I believe that he was in Colorado with Eric Bieniemy back in the 90s.
I think what you brought up was more interesting. That's why I mentioned, I talked about it. But I think Kingsbury, look, he had Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes went 10th in the draft. Mm-hmm. Baker Mayfield got out of there, and Baker Mayfield went first. Mm-hmm. Baker Mayfield's a huge talent. I love Baker Mayfield. Patrick Mahomes is more talented than Baker Mayfield. He's also taller. He does anything that Baker Mayfield has that would cause him to go first. Mahomes has more of. Why didn't he go first? Mm-hmm. The answer is he wasn't with Lincoln Riley, right?
Here it is. Steve Wilkes pays his dues, comes up through the ranks, gets hired, gets fired after 1 year.
Because that's their way of saying, you know what, we gave a nigga a chance. Don't bother us anymore for the next 5 coaching decisions that we make. Okay, we did your Rooney Rule bullshit. We hired the black guy. And they love to hire the black guy when the team is terrible so that he can go 3-13 and they can let him go. And then find the Sean McVay dude. And then the Sean McVay dude goes 7-9 over the next 4 years. And then they say, well, we're going to have to let him go and find somebody else. That's how most of these NFL franchises operate. And look, we all know Sean McVay is a genius. But geniuses come along maybe once every 20, 25 years. And it's more about your understanding of the game than what you look like. But once again, there's always going to be a correlation based on the exterior and your proficiency.
Now, granted, it wasn't great. And as an organization, you can do as you please as far as hiring and firing whoever. But you come back and you hire a guy who had a losing record at Texas Tech in the Big 12. And I know people will say, but it's Texas Tech. Guess what? Mike Leach won there. His predecessor won there, went 47-33 in the Big 12. Okay, so that's my whole problem with this whole situation is I can understand if you want to fire Steve Wilkes. I get it. You have that right to do that. But you're going to replace him with this guy right here in Kliff Kingsbury?
Well, I understand that, Stephen A. Smith, but I also understand why you put out that disclaimer. Because there are a lot of simpletons out there. But once again, no matter what you're saying, you're not going to make most of those dudes in the NFL understand what they should be protesting because that's not what they're accustomed to their whole life. Most of these guys did not grow up around a black authoritarian. Now, some of them may have gotten their football careers started off in some of these peewee leagues or these football junior leagues, and they may have had adult black male authority figures. But when they're going home and they're dealing with that matriarchal energy, that's what they're accustomed to. That's what they're accustomed to. So it's not going to resonate in their mind, oh, we got to stick up for this guy because he's black. They're worried about making sure that they're getting those checks. So they want the best coach, period. They're not worried about having a black coach. They want to have the best coach that they can have, and then on top of that, their contracts are not guaranteed. So why are they going to start to picket or protest for something that they're not sure is going to have legs? At least with the Colin Kaepernick thing, it's getting pushed and propagated on the mainstream sports media so much that they know, okay, this is a legitimate protest. We can get down on one knee for Colin Kaepernick because ESPN is telling us, and ABC and NBC and CBS are telling us this is what we should do. How many of these major networks are going to get behind many of these black players if they get upset about black coaches not being hired or getting fired prematurely, quote unquote, or allegedly fired prematurely? Very, very few of them, because they're trying to disenfranchise the black man themselves. These major networks are trying to disenfranchise the black man, or at least to push forth in their agenda to continue to disenfranchise the so-called black man. Because that's what the Black Lives Matter movement is about. It's about disenfranchising the black man. I hope that you brothers understand that. All you have to do is go to their website and they'll tell you that themselves.
I'm just saying that, listen, we made so much noise. You got players making so much noise about Colin Kaepernick and the national anthem. And then you've got folks talking about how he needs to get a job. What about brothers that have paid their dues in the National Football League, starving for an opportunity that are clearly not in the pipeline when you have a Rooney Rule in place that mandates that they're supposed to be legitimately considered for these positions? And clearly,
well, they are quote unquote legitimately considered, Stephen A. Smith. When you know that your team is going to be terrible, you hire a black guy and you let him sit around for a couple of years. That's what they did with Hugh Jackson in Cleveland. That's what they did with Steve Wilkes in Arizona. That's how they get around the Rooney Rule. They hired a black guy when they know that the team is going to be very, very bad. They let him suffer the consequences of how terrible the team is. Then they could fire him. And they have the excuse that the team did not grow under his tenure. And they don't have to worry about being harassed about not giving black coaches a chance because they just gave one a chance.
Whether it's John Gruden with the GM position, whether it was Lynch before in San Francisco, whether you have some of these coaches that have been hired, and the process that has been circumvented and route to them getting the job. Nobody's talking about that, but we'll talk about Colin Kaepernick.
That's why I brought up the stereotype about African-American quarterbacks once upon a time, because that may have been pushed over now to without even decision makers realizing it, giving them the benefit of the doubt. That
I agree with that. Right now, it's no longer taboo to have a black quarterback. But when it comes to the black quarterback issue, the main issue with that is that many of these head coaches treat their black quarterbacks like they're running backs who can throw, as opposed to treating them like they're quarterbacks. And that's a whole other issue for another day. But no, it's no longer taboo to have a black quarterback.
Like, why aren't we seeing more African-American candidates as offensive coordinators, even on the college level, that would put them, is that a holdover from the idea that they're not capable of doing that?
And that's the point that I was going to make. The big issue right now, whether it be the pros and in college, there's just not enough black play callers on either level, and we see where things are trending, and it's going to be
or GMs or owners, decision makers. But one thing I want to say with Kingsbury and LaFleur, my mind was exactly where you were. Copycat league, they're looking for the next Sean McVay. And the other thought I did have, to your point, they also have the complexion for the connection.
Absolutely. That's the old Muhammad Ali line. They got the complexion for the connection. They even got the same hairstyle as Dan McVay has. Okay? The difference is that what has Kingsbury done to get an immediate head coaching position? Like, I could see if he got an offensive coordinator position somewhere or a quarterback coach position in the NFL somewhere, but damn, they just flagrant with it. Gave that man a head coaching spot right off the jump. Shit.
That's right. I like that line. But let me ask you this question before we go to break, Molly. How do you feel about Kingsbury getting the job, but Kevin Sumlin was at Texas A&M? Had a pretty decent. I mean, there was games that he didn't win against big-time competition. He should have won.
Right, but Stephen A. Smith, we already know Kevin Sumlin does not have the complexion for the connection, and they're going to use his association with Johnny Manziel against him. Even though Kliff Kingsbury was also associated with Johnny Manziel, they're going to use Kevin Sumlin's association with Johnny Manziel against him.
But that guy had to get a job at Arizona because, my God, you wasn't going to get an NFL gig.
It's the same thing I talk about. We keep talking about McVay. How about what Anthony Lynn's done this year?
Right.
It's the same idea.
By the way, because we haven't really laid out the case against Kingsbury, it seems like because we took it in another direction. If you want to see the case laid out perfectly, the big lead, Ryan Phillips, has the case against Kingsbury today check it out. It spells it out. There's really, I mean, that's the entire
And to
argument.
close this out, I also want to say, I hope LaFleur and Kingsbury do a fantastic
Yeah,
job.
it's not about
They're
them.
excellent
It's not about
hires.
them.
It's a bigger issue. It's much more.
But anyway, that's basically it on that when it comes to Mr. Kliff Kingsbury and him being hired by the Arizona Cardinals.